Okay, welcome back to Acts chapter 15. We're in the middle of Paul's second missionary journey and forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the gospel in modern-day Western Turkey, at least initially, because God's got plans for Paul and Silas in Greece. And we begin reading now in verse number 11 of Acts chapter 16. So putting out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the day following to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi. Whoa, there's going to be a letter written to Philippi. We're going to eventually read it, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia. Remember that Paul had that vision, a man in Macedonia saying, come over and help us. A Roman colony, and we were staying in this city for some days. So back to our little map, just so you get this reference point here, okay? Here they are. This white is the Aegean Sea. Here's Troas. We just read about it. And then we see Philippi here in the northern coast of the Aegean Sea. And they did make a few stops along the way getting there, but here's where they're at this point in time. All right, let's keep reading then in verse number 13 as the gospel penetrates what would be Europe. How about that? Because now we're in Greece. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to a riverside where we were supposing there would be a place of prayer. And we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. And so a place of prayer, assuming that there's no synagogue there, just a small group of Jews. And they meet to have prayer along the river someplace where Philippi is located. And here is now the story of the first convert. And it's interesting that in the vision, Paul saw a man in Macedonia saying, come over and help us. But the first person who responds to the gospel is a woman. Verse number 14, a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics. Wow, the first person saved in Europe, as far as we know, is a woman, and she's a businesswoman. Oh my goodness. And she's selling a certain kind of fabric, purple fabric. My understanding, and you may have heard this, is that back in that day, purple was a color that was only worn by the wealthy and by royalty because the dyes from which purple fabric was made was, I think, from a snail or something, that had a purple color. And it was very expensive, of course, to get these snails and to create the dyes that ultimately created the purple fabric. And so that's what Lydia's into, a good businesswoman, a good Jewish businesswoman. And she's a worshiper of God, was listening. And I just want to just pause there for just a second. She's a worshiper of God. Was she a Jew by birth and a believer in, the God of the Jews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Or was she a Gentile convert who identified with the Jewish religion? Either way, her heart was open and receptive even before Paul got there. In her life, she's already seeking God. You see that? She's already meeting with a group of other people to pray. And, just think about that for a second, because it has interesting ramifications. God knows the hearts of all people, and He knows whose hearts are softening, whose hearts are open. He knows whose hearts are closed or closing. And so who's He going to send us? Who's He going to lead us to share the gospel with? Is He going to lead us to share the gospel with people whose hearts He already knows are dead set closed, or just about closed and, in the process of closing? Maybe, but is it more likely that He would send us to people whose hearts are open or opening? I think the answer to that is obvious. So we ought to be praying, hey, Lord, direct me to people whose hearts are opening. Verse number 14, the second part. Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. Certain groups, one certain group of people loves to grab onto that text right there and say, well, there it is. There's another proof that salvation is a sovereign act of God. He sovereignly selects people before creation to be saved. All the rest He's chosen to be damned. And here's a perfect example. This is a proof of it. Well, I just want you to stop and think for a second. Is God involved in opening the hearts of anyone who gets saved and everyone who gets saved? Of course he is. That's true, but it can be said about anyone. The Lord opened my heart. The Lord opened your heart. The Lord opened the hearts of the camera people who are videotaping this right now. All right? But does that mean that I and they and you had nothing to do with it? Does that verse prove that? No, 1,000 times no, and any honest person will have to admit that. God is the initiator in salvation. What he does, his part compared to our part in the salvation process is hardly of any comparison, because God does 99.999999% of what's required for someone to be saved. Our part is to yield in our hearts and to believe with the help of the Holy Spirit. But the Holy Spirit's trying to reach everybody. Okay, so this verse, this uses a proof text for those folks who say that salvation is a sovereign act of God, but by his foreordination or his fortune. That verse doesn't say that, doesn't prove that at all. And you think about it. You think about, we've gone through Matthew, we've gone through the first 15 or half chapters of Acts, we've been through James, and we've been through Galatians. How many texts have we seen that those folks can even use to support their ideas? Just a couple here and there. And that's exactly how they prove it out. They pull all these verses out of their context and assemble them together and say, well, here's the truth. Whereas I could pull out, and we have seen thousands of verses and passages in what we've read so far that go against that idea that God sovereignly selects some to be saved and some to be damned. All right, so something to think about. All right, well, we got to stop here because we're out of time, so we're going to read more about Lydia's conversion and what happens next. It's trouble there, but I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.